Good morning, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and welcome to Law and Crime Live, where we cover some of the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. And today, we're covering two of the biggest cases in the country right now. That's right, we're covering the Donald Smith case out of Florida and the George Burch case out of Wisconsin. I want to talk about the George Burch case first, okay? So this case, we expect a live feed in the courtroom at 9:30 a.m. As soon as we have a feed, we'll make sure to go to it. George Burch is on trial for the murder of Nicole Vanderheiden back in May of 2016. I want to show a picture of her right there. I want everyone to see this beautiful young mother that was taken in the prime of her life. He is charged with first-degree intentional homicide, okay? Now, Nicole's body was found 3 miles from her home. 3 miles, there you go, that's her right there, beautiful young mother. Her body was found 3 miles from her home. She suffered blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. George Burch's DNA was all over her body. His cell phone evidence shows, the data from his cell phone shows that he was in 4 key locations that night, including where her body was found. Now, it might seem as an open and shut case, but not so fast, because the defense is not refuting any of that evidence. They're saying, despite all that evidence, George Burch is not the one that killed Nicole, but it was her boyfriend, Douglas Dietrich, that he's the one who did it. Now, what we saw yesterday, Douglas Dietrich took the stand, and as you can imagine, he denied most of it. He denied the kind of relationship that the defense has painted it as. He said they didn't have a toxic relationship. They weren't even fighting in the night in question. I want to play you a little bit of his testimony because he is going back on the stand today. He is such a pivotal witness for both the state and the defense. So let's take a look from yesterday.
Is everyone having fun?
Yeah, everybody was having fun. And
were you drinking that night?
yes, I was.
Was Nikki drinking that night?
Yep.
When you guys were together during the concert, how were you getting along?
Very well. Everything was going good. I remember leaving to get her, I think, another beer, or I think she had some ginger ale or cider beer or whatever. I got her at the beer stand. And, you know, we were long lines with that. You know, it took like 5-10 minutes for each little trip, but and working through the shuffle of people. But
were the two of you fighting at all at the watering hole?
no, we were not.
Did you see any of the other people in your group fighting or arguing?
No, I didn't see any. No, there was no fighting going on.
While you were at the watering hole, did you run into any other people that you knew?
Oh yeah, there's a few other people that I knew. I ran into, actually right after we had gotten our wristband, we ran into an acquaintance that I'd known that works at the Greystone Ale House, which is close to my house. I ran into him and, you know, kind of introduced Nikki to him and had a short talk with him. I didn't know him that well, you know, and just said, hey, have fun at the show. And
were you with Nikki during most of the show?
most of the show, yep. And I think it was before or after the one band, Annex, had played. I think we caught the tail end of that, and then we were up at the actual bar where towards the front of the building, getting some drinks, and then Nikki had ran into a few of her friends and introduced me that I hadn't met before, and had a brief little chit chat, and they talked about whatever, and, you know, how are things going, talked about Dylan, and I guess his life in general.
Again, that's Douglas Dietrich, the boyfriend of Nicole Vanderheiden, the victim in this case, saying they weren't fighting in the night in question. There didn't seem to be any problems. But is it that simple? I'm here with criminal defense attorney Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, he's coming back on the stand today. He's denied that they were fighting. He said that at one point Nicole did get upset at him, was sending him threatening text messages. Are you talking to other women? He's denying most of it. But we found out last night that the judge is reviewing videotape of Doug in the bar about whether or not he was actually talking to other women. The prosecution says it's not relevant. The defense says it is. What do you make of it?
I think if the video comes in, it could really be a game changer. It's going to speak to the credibility of Douglas Dietrich. Now, he's saying he wasn't talking to other women, but if the video is showing exactly the opposite, he's going to be in a lot of trouble because remember, it's up to the jurors to decide whether he's telling the truth or not.
And remember, the defense is saying that they had a toxic relationship. He had motive to kill Nicole. Then again, people get upset with their spouses. They get upset with their boyfriends and girlfriends. They don't talk to them. They walk out on them. Enough to be a murderer?
It's hard to say here. I mean, the fact that Burch's DNA is found all over the victim in this case is going to be a big hurdle for the defense to overcome, and I think time will tell if they'll be able to do it.
But the big question is that he wasn't George Burch didn't know Nicole, and Douglas Dietrich did. You always look at the boyfriend, you always look at the husband. We see it so many times in these cases. Now, he was arrested, he was cleared by the police, and now George Burch is the one on trial. We're going to cover that case. Again, we expect a live feed at 9:30 a.m. But we are also closely monitoring another case. This is a case out of Florida, the Donald Smith case. This is a man who was convicted of abducting, raping, and murdering an 8-year-old girl named Cherish Periwinkle, a beautiful young girl. We're going to talk about it when we come back. And now he's in the penalty phase. The jury has to decide, will he be sentenced to life in prison or the death penalty? Closing arguments will occur in that case today. We're going to cover that most when we come back from this short commercial break. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We're covering the George Burch case out of Wisconsin, a man who is claiming that he was falsely accused. He is on trial for the murder of Nicole Vanderheiden back in May of 2016. He's charged with first-degree intentional homicide, and despite overwhelming forensic data against him, his DNA is all over her body. Data from his cell phone indicates that he was at the crime scene and where her body was found. He's saying he wasn't the one who did it, but it was Nicole's boyfriend, Douglas Dietrich. They're saying that he's the person who did it. Now, we saw the testimony from Doug on the stand yesterday. He's coming back to the stand today. We expect a live feed again at 9:30 a.m. As soon as we have it, we'll make sure to go live into the courtroom. But I want to play you what you might have missed from yesterday. So now, here is where Doug talks about how much he and Nicole and everybody there had to drink that night. Remember, they went to different bars. They were at a concert. This is the night before she went missing and was ultimately found dead. Let's take a look.
You recall, at least up until the time that you separated, was Nikki drinking fairly regularly as well?
Yep.
Have you had drinks with Nikki in the past?
Yes, I have.
Was she a frequent drinker?
No, she wasn't. It was more when we had first met. We went out quite often, you know, on the weekends. And then, of course, when she was pregnant, she didn't drink at all. And we'd still go out, and she would drive and be the designated driver, and go out and meet up with various friends and have a good time. And she would drive and get us home. But then afterwards, I think she probably only drank a handful of times at most since Dylan was born.
Okay, so that's what you meant by afterwards. So since Dylan was born, she was an infrequent drinker?
Yeah.
Do you know if she, what was the pace she was drinking that night?
Pretty quickly. I mean, I remember on the first, I think, beer or two, I think it was in plastic cups, and I think she had like 2 down, and I was still on my first one. And thought I was drinking it kind of fast, and she was chugging them down pretty.
And you were drinking at a pretty fair pace yourself?
Yes.
After you got separated from Nikki, you mentioned some shots. Were you taking shots at the watering hole?
Yeah, I had numerous shots. I mean, like probably a good handful of shots.
And you met up with some friends of yours, you and Greg?
Yep.
Specifically, you mentioned a Katie. Who was that?
It was Katie Hanna at the time. She was actually, at the time, she was married to I think the singer of Annex that was the opening band.
And you and Greg were talking to her together?
Alcohol is an important factor in any kind of criminal case, and here maybe more than others. I'm here again with criminal defense attorney Yosha Gunasekera. Why does the amount of alcohol that either Nicole drank or he drank, why does that matter in this case?
Well, alcohol is funny, and it can work in so many different ways, either to the advantage of the defense or the prosecution. Here, it's really going to come down to how well does Mr. Dietrich remember the events of the night. Now, that can be played multiple ways. Here, he can say, you know, I was just a little bit out of it, that's why I don't remember all the specifics, and that really hurts the defense. But what if he was so intoxicated he didn't remember what he was doing that night and therefore, you know, harmed somebody? That's what the defense...
Well, isn't that a stretch? You get so drunk you don't remember killing someone? Because let's call a spade here, Yosha. What we know, what the jury doesn't know, is that because the defense has not presented their case as of yet, but what we've read about this case is that George Burch is going to testify that he was knocked out by Douglas Dietrich, and when he woke up, Douglas Dietrich had already killed Nicole, and he forced him at gunpoint to bury the body. I don't care how intoxicated you are. That doesn't fly. Now, wouldn't the better instance here be for the defense? Well, if you really don't remember a lot of the details about what you did at the bar, who you were talking to, if you were flirting or not, Let's play the videotape from the bar, which is right now the issue in the case. The judge has to decide whether or not to play that video from the bar. Isn't that the real issue?
So that really goes to the credibility, but as you stated, the defense's theory of the case is insane. So I think what they're doing is they're trying to push it all the way. They really have to say he was so intoxicated, Douglas Dietrich was so out of his mind, high on marijuana, drunk with all of these shots, that he was able to do this kind of incredible thing.
And he also denies snorting Adderall, which is confirmed by one of his friends, Greg Matthew, who testified yesterday. When Doug was on the stand, he said, the only drug that I may have had was marijuana, but his friend said, I think he might have been snorting Adderall. And there's a question about, was he doing other drugs that night? So if a juror hears that he's lying about one thing, what else could he be lying about?
Exactly.
And I'm presuming he's...
But it's just creating this kind of chaotic situation from this guy who was like, I was just having a couple drinks, to someone who was not only having a couple of drinks, but then was mixing it with drugs. And again, there's such a high standard here that the defense really, I mean, they don't have to prove any case, but really, they are trying to prove something.
We know that they went from one bar, and then Nicole and a group of friends went to another bar without Doug. Doug didn't come with them to that second bar. The fact of how much she was drinking, because we know from some of the witnesses who testified, she got angry at Doug through text messages and ran off from the bar. Someone had to chase her. And the fact that how much she was drinking, does that matter?
Yes, it definitely matters. I mean, it could explain why they were in an argument that night. Two drunken people are not necessarily always thinking sensibly. And so that could go to the fact that, you know, Doug didn't want to kill her. They were just having an argument that night.
Right. Okay, Yosha, you know what? There's a lot at stake here. There's a lot at stake for this case. And we're playing this case for you because we want you to understand what's happening. Because really, I would love to show a picture of the victim right here. I want everybody to have an image of this beautiful young woman. Okay, we're talking about Nicole Vanderheiden. Okay, she was a beautiful young mother who was taken in the prime of her life. Now, one of the things about this case that makes it so interesting, and the reason we have Douglas Dietrich on the stand, is because Fitbit data is going to be used in this case. Namely, that Douglas Dietrich was wearing a Fitbit band the entire night. Now, the court ruled that the step counting data, so where he actually went, can be used in court, meaning we can track his location in the night in question. But the sleep counting data can't be used. That's an issue that's still being resolved in the legal system. Now, the sleep data issue would be important to use because we know when he was resting. But the fact that Fitbit data is going to be used to track where this alternate suspect was that night, this is a groundbreaking legal development, ladies and gentlemen. That's what makes this case so unique. That is why everybody is following it. Fitbit data being used. It's the same thing as when cell phone data was first used. Can we track people's location? That's what makes this case unique. Again, we are waiting for a live feed in the courtroom. As soon as we have it, we'll make sure to go to it. There's a lot of interesting things happening here when you have that alternate suspect theory. And again, we're carefully monitoring the Donald Smith case out of Florida, the man, that convicted child rapist and murderer. It is his penalty phase. What will the jury decide? We're going to see closing arguments later today. You're not going to want to miss anything. We're going to go to a quick break. We'll be right back. Hey everybody, welcome back to Law&Crime Live. We have a big day today. We're covering two of the biggest cases in the country right now. And one of those cases is the Donald Smith case out of Florida, okay? We've talked about this case constantly this week. It's a really sad case about a man who was convicted of abducting, brutally raping, and killing a beautiful 8-year-old girl named Cherish Periwinkle. I want to show her photo to the viewers right now because this beautiful young girl was taken way too soon, and in such a brutal way. Now, the reason we're talking about Donald Smith is even though he was convicted, that same jury has to decide what is going to happen to him. They have to decide what his fate will be. Will that be life in prison without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty? And in Florida, where this case is taking place, you need a unanimous jury verdict. That means all 12 jurors have to vote in favor of the death penalty for it to attach. Easier said than done. Now, the defense has tried to paint Mr. Smith as a pedophile, a sick individual who couldn't control his impulses. That was one argument. And maybe it's going to sway some jurors, maybe it won't. But the last witness that the defense called was Donald Smith's son, Donald Smith Jr. Now, what they tried to do there was paint him as a human being. As tough as that is to say, that's what they tried to do. And it was an interesting ploy to make him the last witness to testify for the defense. I want to play you some of his testimony from yesterday. Take a look.
Has your father's institutionalization helped you keep sober? Yeah, because I could have easily ended up in prison, and part of me, feels like who would I have been if he would have done all the things that a father usually does with their kid, playing catch and going fishing and stuff. But I've still learned just as good a lesson, if not better, because he wasn't around, and I never ever got to do any of those things with my real dad. Now I know exactly what I need to do as a father. So it taught me some great lessons.
Are you closer to your biological father, Donald James Smith, than anybody else in your family at this point?
Him and my grandma, which is his mom, those are the two people I'm closest with.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. That is a son of a convicted child rapist and murderer. Unbelievable. I'm here with criminal defense attorney Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, you watched that. Amazing. I think it's amazing that you hear a young man talking about his father, and he said his father wasn't around for most of his life. When he was, they did drugs together, they didn't play catch, but he did learn from his father, and he says they have a good relationship now. Unbelievable, right?
It is. It's unbelievable given the fact that, his father was so absent in his life, that he does want Donald Smith to live, to try to continue, that relationship, even though that relationship is going to be one in which Donald Smith is going to be behind bars for the rest of his life. He would still like to continue and grow and learn from that.
Let's ask the million-dollar question. Did that influence at least one juror that Donald Smith doesn't deserve to die?
Maybe in other cases, but the fact that a verdict was returned in 15 minutes is just, it's so incredible, and it's so rare in a case of this magnitude. The fact that the jurors throughout the trial were turning away, were wincing, were visibly physically upset. I don't know if they're going to be able to overcome that. I don't know if hearing just from a family member and from a doctor that says, Donald Smith had abuse in his life, I don't know if that is enough for them not to sentence him to death.
Yes, I don't think anybody who listens to this, even me included, who's been following this case, it's extremely tough to listen to. But I think, isn't it still a separate issue about whether you can sentence someone to death? You have someone's life in your hands. So as much as you might hate this person, it's tough for people to get over the fact that your decision, you're playing life and death here. And no matter what happens, it's a tough decision about who to do that to.
It's an extremely tough decision, and it's a huge responsibility for those jurors. If you'll remember, when they were picked and they were rating how they felt about the death penalty on a scale of 1 to 5, they were really falling around 2.53. So you have people who, if necessary, could sentence someone to death. So you don't have jurors necessarily who are completely opposed to the death penalty here. And so it's going to be interesting to see, ultimately how they feel.
Yeah. What do you think that the defense and the state has to do in their closing arguments today to really seal up their points?
I think the prosecution is going to rely on the fact that this man is a monster, that they had, doctors testify that his brain is just different from other brains, that empathy is not there, and that if he, ever had, even behind jail, this crime is so terrible. He has terrorized so many people. You heard from that other woman who he tried to kidnap, when she was a young child, and just
Carrie Ann Buck.
Yes,
yeah.
And that was chilling. Just hearing how she hid in the tunnel of that slide, they're going to reference those people and say, there's a very human face to the evil that this man has done.
Human face that the court system has seen quite a lot of. In fact, we have the testimony right now of Michael Boson. He's a criminal defense attorney who's going to explain, he testified earlier in this case, about how Donald Smith was in and out of the law constantly for many sexual acts, very lewd acts. And the question becomes, why was he out when Cherish Periwinkle was? Could this have been avoided? I want to play you some of his testimony from earlier in the case.
Again, it's kind of a blend. There's a certain, once it's determined or by evaluators, psychiatrists, that a person does meet the criteria for civil commitment, the individual then is afforded an opportunity to enter into a a disposition, a plea, or to go through trial. The trial could be in front of a judge or could be in front of a jury, and the jury then must determine beyond a lower a threshold. I believe it's clear and convincing evidence that a person actually committed the offense and is a danger or likelihood to reoffend. So it's all based on whether or not is the person likelihood to reoffend or not, and if the person is likely to reoffend, then the person remains in commitment status.
And is it true that any time someone gets a prison sentence, they will be evaluated to see if they meet this criteria?
Yes, that's how it's supposed to work, correct.
Even if the offense that they go to prison for on that particular occasion is not sexual related?
Correct.
Okay. But ultimately, it's the state of Florida that either petitions or brings the Jimmy Rice or withdraws it.
That's correct.
I'm showing you what's been marked as Defendant 7 and introduced. Is this an order of release and order of dismissal?
Yes, it is in reference to the same case that I referenced, 99-1635. Donald Smith as the respondent. He's not the defendant because it's not criminal, it's civil. It is an order of release and order of dismissal done and ordered in chambers April 15th, 2002.
Okay. And what does the term voluntarily dismissed mean?
Voluntarily dismissed would mean that it was initiated and dismissed. The dismissal was initiated and signed off on by the state.
The state of Florida?
Yes.
And that would be through the state attorney's office?
That's correct.
Okay. So ultimately, this resulted on April 15th, 2002, to Mr. Smith's release back into the community?
That is correct.
I'm going to show you Defendants 8. This is a final judgment?
It is. It's in reference to several cases, 2 second-degree felonies, 2 third-degree felonies involving property crimes, dealing in stolen property, and false verification of ownership in a pawn, which basically means that when you go into a pawn shop, you sign acknowledging that you are the owner of the property that's being pawned. And when it was found out that Mr. Smith was not the owner, he was then charged with the false verification.
Okay, let's try to break this one.
Release, and then he's in prison, and then he's released. And it is odd to see this, especially when someone is a predicate felon. Here in New York, there's mandatory minimum sentencing, and that was not applied here in the states where he was committing these crimes. But I think what's very interesting about this is not a debate about whether he's going to get released back into the community. This is a debate about whether he's going to be imprisoned for the rest of his life or put to death. So I don't know if this testimony necessarily solves all the questions that the jurors may have in their minds.
Right, so some of this testimony would have made sense if, hey, should we release him? It seems like a parole hearing. Should we release him back into the community, or should he remain in prison? That's not the question. His life is over one way or another. He's either going to be in prison or he's going to be sentenced to death. Can you just explain to our viewers a little bit what his life will be like if he is sentenced to life in prison? How's he going to fare in the general population? And then what will happen if he's on death row?
So prison is just generally a terrible place for most people.
Shocker.
Yes, shocker. It's definitely a terrible place just for the average person who's, stealing something from a store. But word gets around if you have committed sexual offenses against children, and he is much more likely to face violence from other prisoners and perhaps even death. So in general population, he's going to be in danger. Now, if he was put in protective custody, what's commonly known as the hole, you're in a room for 23 out of 24 hours a day. So while you are safe, you're not seeing sunlight for most of the day, and you're very, very isolated.
Didn't Smith not originally want to fight the death penalty? Didn't he want the death penalty because he knew what would await him if he spent life in prison?
Yes. Generally, death rows in most states, you're still very isolated. I think he would actually probably be safer from bodily harm on death row. And that is what he wanted, because he knows life in prison for the rest of his life is going to be a miserable experience. It is whether your life is in danger or not, but he's always going to have to be looking over his shoulder.
Yosha, we talk about this case and we're trying to make sense of it, and the jury came back 12 minutes with their verdict of convicting him. Do you think that they're going to take that long to figure out what to sentence him to, or is it going to take some time? Because it's a little bit different than convicting somebody. I
think it's going to take a little bit more time here. There, it was pretty certain that they knew he was guilty, but here, I mean, the punishment is just, it's such a heavy weight. I keep saying that, but it is. It's such a heavy decision to have to essentially play God and have to control someone else's life. So I would imagine that they would take a little bit more time. There could be definitely differences of opinions that they're all going to have to discuss, because remember, it has to be unanimous for him to be sentenced to death.
Yeah. Interesting case we're following here. We're covering the Donald Smith case out of Florida. As soon as we have an update in that case, if something's going on in the closing arguments, we'll make sure to go to it. But I also want to tell our viewers that we're covering the George Burch case out of Wisconsin, this very, very interesting and pivotal case that sets a different precedent for the legal community. A man who's charged with first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Nicole Vanderheiden back in May of 2016. She suffered blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation, and despite the defendant's DNA all over the body and cell phone evidence linking him to different crime areas, different areas of the crime, including where her body was found, he's saying that someone else did it. And not just someone else, but Nicole's boyfriend, Douglas Dietrich. We saw him testify yesterday, and he's going to continue testifying today. That boyfriend is going back into the stand, and you can imagine the defense is going to hammer away at him some more. We are waiting for a live feed, but the reason we are waiting is because there is an issue going on right now in the courtroom about whether or not to show videotape footage from where the bar where Doug was the night in question. And that's the question. That's the question. Can they show that footage? And that's going to be the issue. We'll wait to see. And I want to show our clip right now. We have a clip from yesterday of Douglas Dietrich on the stand. Take a look.
We're all successful.
Correct.
Were you ultimately able to have contact with Dallas on the ride home?
I think so. I don't really recall. I know I tried to call her when we were in Greg's car, and I don't know if I left a message or I talked to her. I'm kind of unclear on that. I thought I talked to her and said that having a conversation that she didn't know where Nikki was or hadn't heard from her.
And you know about what time you got home that night?
Around 2:30, I would say.
And what happened when you got home?
Came in, I remember Dallas saying that Dylan was sleeping upstairs. I did go upstairs and checked on him and went downstairs. I don't know, and Greg and I were talking, and you know, I'd asked Dallas if she had heard from Nikki or who she would be, where she would have gone, if she had any idea of, you know, who she would contact.
What was your mood with respect to Nikki at that point?
I was starting to get a little more concerned, you know, where she is, you know. I figured she'd be coming home that night, and you know, I was kind of, you know, getting a little maybe worried that she wasn't going to come home, but you know, maybe she was pretty intoxicated and going to be staying somewhere else, and was going to be, you know, to come home in the morning.
Who leaves first between Dallas and Greg?
I believe Greg did. I think they left pretty close to each other. I mean, within minutes. Not too clear, but I do kind of remember, I think, talking to Dallas after Greg had left.
And do you remember what you were talking to Dallas about?
Not really. I remember asking, you know, at some point in there, it's not too long of a conversation, you know, where Nikki could have been, and you know, she was sending me texts like this, and I don't know why she's upset. And
did you actually show Dallas or tell Dallas about some of the text messages?
I don't know if I actually showed her the text. I may have, but I don't recall if I did or not.
Did you make her aware of them?
Yeah, yes.
And did Dallas have any information about Nikki's whereabouts at that time?
No, she did not. Was
there any discussion between you and Dallas about marijuana?
I think there was. I remember it being discussed if we would smoke and then was going to go to bed. And I don't know, think it was brought out. And I don't know if I don't remember smoking, but I don't know.
Possible.
It's possible, yes.
All right, so that's Douglas Dietrich. That was the boyfriend of Nicole Vanderheiden, the victim in this case, the George Burch case, testifying about his relationship with Nicole and what he did the night in question. It seemed they got into a disagreement, and he just went home, didn't pay much attention, did his own thing, didn't seem to worry until she didn't come home the next day. I'm here again with criminal defense attorney Yosha Gunasekera. Bad boyfriend or killer? What do you think?
It's hard to say, but it doesn't look great regardless, because he goes home, he's assuming that she's still out with friends. He wakes up at 6:30 a.m. because the baby is crying, and at that point was like, gives the baby a bottle and goes back to sleep, and really doesn't act on his worry about her until 2 p.m. the next day, which is a little alarming.
Right, that's when he filed that missing persons report. He realized something was going on. I think
Yes.
it was either 2 or 6. It was sometime in the afternoon. But, okay, we've all get into fights with people. We ignore them. He said she thought maybe she slept at a friend's house, something like that. I don't see what the defense is arguing yet, that this guy, when would he have had the opportunity to kill Nicole? I just don't see it yet. I mean, we heard testimony from the babysitter. We heard testimony from people that saw him that night. We have to wait for the defense to put on their case. But do you see it yet?
Well, we all get in fights with people, of course, but then our significant other doesn't usually end up dead. So that's why this is being under a microscope. Yes, in the normal course of events, people fight all the time. That's totally normal, but this is an exceptional circumstance, and that's what the defense wants to capitalize on.
Yosha, he's coming back on the stand today. If you're a great defense attorney, if you were arguing for George Burch, would you ask him straight up, did you kill Nicole Vanderheiden? How would you flavor it today? What would you say?
I mean, you can ask that, but you know what the response is going to be. They'll probably ask it. He'll probably say, no, of course not. But it really, it's less about those big trigger questions and more about just creating this pattern of a bad boyfriend, of someone who, drank too much. Maybe he did it because it was a mistake, but really it's all they have. It's all the defense has in this case, because with Burch, his DNA is on the scene. This would be an entirely different case. In fact, Burch probably wouldn't have even been arrested if his DNA wasn't on the scene. So really, attacking Douglas Dietrich is all they have.
We're talking about George Burch, the defendant. We're talking about that alternate suspect, Doug Dietrich. But really, let's focus on the victim here, Nicole Vanderheiden. I would like to show a picture of her if we can, really have our viewers really see who this beautiful young mother was, taken in the prime of her life. Just when you see these senseless crimes, and that's how the state targeted this. They said this was a random act of violence, Yosha. But what makes more sense, a random act of violence from George Burch, who didn't know her, or a killer that had a motive and somebody who knew her, meaning Douglas Dietrich, her boyfriend?
Douglas Dietrich makes so much more sense, which is why they initially arrested him and kept him in jail for, I think, 16 or 17 days, because he's a killer who makes sense in this case.
It does make sense, although we have to wait what the defense will do. Now, the agreement that the defense has with the prosecution is they can't put on their case until George Burch testifies, which means we will cover it here live when that happens. When George Burch testifies, which will explain the whole theory of the defense's case about how he knew Nicole and how Douglas Dietrich ended up killing her, this is all according to the defense, that is when things will take a different turn. Right now, the state is continuing their case. We're going to cover it live as soon as we have an update. The judge and the attorneys are working through an issue right now. You're not going to want to miss anything. This is an explosive case. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law&Crime Live, everybody. And speaking of live, we have a live feed right now in the Donald Smith case out of Florida. The prosecution is delivering their closing arguments in the penalty phase for the man who was convicted of the abduction, rape, and murder of a beautiful 8-year-old girl named Cherish Periwinkle. Let's listen in.
Wrap something around her neck. And for over 3 minutes, while she fought, while she struggled, while she suffered, he strangled the life from her body. And then he took her limb
lifeless body, trudged through the woods, waded through the water, and he tried to hide what he did. He stuffed that little girl's body in a log. He buried her under a tree branch and debris and asphalt. He tried to hide what he did. But ladies and gentlemen, today in this courtroom, he cannot hide from you what he did. On behalf of the state of Florida, Ms. Nelson, Ms. Wheeler-Sanchez, we thank you for your time and your sacrifice and your attention over the last 3 weeks. It has been a long process, but it's an important one. And we talked about how important it was in jury selection. Remember back on how we discussed the presumption of innocence when it applied to the guilt phase, and how this defendant must be presumed innocent until we, the state of Florida, met our burden, until we did our job. And we proved to you that he was guilty of the crimes he was charged with. And much like that burden, we share a similar burden here today when it comes to the penalty phase. We discussed at length during jury selection that we needed you to come into this process with an open mind, that you could consider aggravation and weigh it and evaluate it and force us to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. And consider mitigation and go through that weighing process. Much like he was presumed innocent, it didn't mean he was innocent. And much like you have to come into this process with an open mind, it does not mean that.
Okay, so the prosecution is delivering their closing arguments in the Donald Smith case, a man who's already been convicted of the abduction, rape, and murder of an 8-year-old girl named Cherish Periwinkle. Now this same jury that convicted him, they're off camera, we're not allowed to show them, but they are listening to the prosecutor delivering these arguments because they have to decide what will happen to Donald Smith. Will they vote in favor of life in prison without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty, which is at stake here in Florida? And you need 12 unanimous jurors, 12, to vote in favor so that that man, Donald Smith, can be sentenced to death. Let's listen in live again for the prosecutor delivering his closing arguments.
You don't go anymore. First, whether each aggravating factors are proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, you will be instructed, and we will discuss later on, the 6 aggravating factors that apply in this case. These are statutory circumstances which elevate the gravity of the crime or the harm to the victim. And we must prove those to you beyond and to the exclusion of a reasonable doubt. 2, whether one or more of the aggravating factors exist beyond a reasonable doubt. So of those 6 that you will be instructed on, you must have at least one factor that you unanimously agree to has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. I would submit to you already, ladies and gentlemen, that your verdict from last week has already established 2 of the aggravating factors beyond a reasonable doubt. And we'll discuss that later. But if you don't have at least one aggravating factor proven beyond a reasonable doubt, then your analysis ends. It stops. It stops there, but I submit to you, you already have proven at least 2. The third step, whether an aggravating factor or factors found to exist beyond a reasonable doubt are sufficient to justify the imposition of the death penalty. So, going step by step, are there aggravating factors? Have they been proven beyond a reasonable doubt? And now, in considering those that have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, are they sufficient to justify the death penalty? If your answer is no, your analysis ends there. you don't need to go any further. You don't even need to consider mitigation at that point.
That's the prosecutor explaining the aggravating factors that the jury could find in determining whether or not Donald Smith should be sentenced to death. I'm here again with Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, you're listening to this, okay? Tons of aggravating factors here. Which one stands out the most for you?
I mean, he was a previous felon. That's one. If the crime is especially heinous or cruel, that's another one. If a crime is against a child, that's another one. There's just so many. So I think they can touch upon all of those and try to get the death penalty here.
And the fact that he raped and killed her in the commission of a kidnapping.
Yes.
You know, it's awful. It's awful to even describe. I'm very curious to hear if they'll come back pretty soon with a verdict after they hear these closing arguments. It's an interesting case out of Florida, sad case, but it's important that we're covering this one because, as the prosecutor said in his closing remarks in the guilt and innocence phase, Cherish Periwinkle now has a voice. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, but when we come back, we're going to cover both the Smith and Burch trials. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss anything. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We have a big update for you out of the George Burch courtroom. Douglas Dietrich, the man who the defense has painted as the real killer in this case, is back on the stand. The defense is cross-examining him, and it's going to get heated. You can imagine what they're going to ask him. Let's listen in live.
Recall who and
Again, you are listening to the testimony of Douglas Dietrich, the victim's boyfriend in the George Burch case, the same person that the defense is claiming is the real killer. I want to continue our conversation with Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, I know we don't have much time left, but you're listening to the continuation of this testimony. What do you make of it? You saw him crying. You heard the text messages between Nicole and Doug. They were colorful. What do you think?
The text messages are certainly troubling, or at least that's how the defense is going to spin it. They're going to say that he was very angry with her that night, and that gave him motive to maybe do something in the heat of the moment. Then, of course, the prosecution is going to spin it and say, what couple doesn't fight? What couple doesn't send angry, regrettable text messages? So it's really interesting to see how these text messages ultimately are going to play out into the whole trial.
And now they're kind of just talking about where he lives and the roads nearby, because the area about where the crime took place was allegedly outside of their house, and then the field where she was eventually found. The geography of this is very important, no?
It is, and that's what they're going to pit Dietrich against Burch, where they were. Burch, as you know, it's going to be the cell phone data that's going to locate him in certain places. Then with Dietrich, it's going to come down to his testimony here. So that's going to be interesting to see where they were at what times in the night to kind of create what happened that night, because no one really knows except, you know, the victim, and obviously she is not here to tell the tale.
Right. Yosha, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody, let's listen in now. We're going to hear Douglas Dietrich back on the stand.
I don't know how recent my last doctor's appointment was and what I weighed.